Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. On the 23rd of December, the French modding team forum and Assetto Corsa League, ACFL, have released this, the 1987 Williams FW11B, for all of us to play with. Unlike a lot of mods that are out there, this one is not strictly freeware. This one is payware from the beginning to the end. However, I recognize how difficult it is for third-party modders to do this work, and particularly to do it to the incredibly high standards that they do, and they're asking a very reasonable price. Up to the 31st of December, they are asking €2.50 for a special introductory offer, and then after the 31st of the year, the price goes up to €5. Again, very, very reasonable, considering the amount of detail and fidelity and fun that this thing is. And of course, we'll get into that in a little bit. The FW11B, this is stereotypical 1980s Formula One. Big wings, big tires, not much downforce, turbo. Lots of turbo. There's plenty of footage of Nigel Mansell and Nelson Piquet wringing this thing's neck in racetracks around the world, going up against the likes of Senna and Prost. It's absolutely ridiculous the amount of power that this thing had, and of course the turbo era in general in Formula One, and actually other disciplines, was just mental in every regard. This is the quintessential mid-80s Formula One car. It's low slung, it's got the big wings, and of course it's got a lot of power in the back. So €2.50 is the introductory price for this, €5 after the first of the year. Incredibly reasonable. A little bit about the car itself. This is the 1987 Williams FW11B. It's derived from the FW11. Of course, this is the car designed and raced by Williams Grand Prix Engineering in the 1986 and 1987 Formula One seasons, designed by Patrick Head and Frank Durney. As you can tell, it is quintessential mid-80s Formula One. Over the course of its 32-race career, it managed to secure 18 victories, 16 pole positions, and 17 fastest laps. It won the Constructors' Championship twice in 1986 and 1987, and it secured the Drivers' Championship for Nelson Piquet one time in 1987. Of course, the car was driven by Nigel Mansell and Nelson Piquet predominantly. Riccardo Patrese also shared that number 5 car with Nigel Mansell on occasion. The car's first race was the 1986 Brazilian Grand Prix. Some technical specs on the beast. The engine in it is a 1.5-liter Honda V6 engine. It is turbocharged, of course. It is the RA166E for the 1986 version, and it's the RA167E for the 1987 version, as we have here. This engine is very close to the engine that was in the back of the McLaren MP44 in 1988. So, of course, just a year's worth of development between this engine and that engine, but very, very similar. 1987, the boost on that engine was limited to 4 bar per the regulations. That's still a phenomenal amount of boost. And in qualifying trim, when you close down the wastegates, well over 1,000 horsepower, no doubt. The gearbox is a 6-speed manual. Love these manual Formula One cars. No frills, just driver skill. Absolutely love it. And of course, these big fat Goodyears all around. Great, great, great. Getting into the details on the car from ACFL. Just look at this thing. Just look at this thing. Look at those tires. You can see there's textures on the tires. It's a marble pickup almost. But it's not. It's just nicely in-depth, I want to say. There's a depth to the texturing on the tires. I like that. Also, you can see on the bodywork, it's high gloss. Alright, I like it. Definitely like it. I have said things in the past about there being high gloss bodywork on Formula One car. I mean, yes, they can be glossy, especially when they're sitting in the pits, and particularly during a wet race, when you see these guys just sitting in the pits, like during a practice session or qualifying session, and they're just waiting for the right moment to go out, and the mechanics are just sitting there with nothing else much to do, so they just sit there and wipe the car down perpetually. It gives it a very nice shine. That's what you see here. I like that. Getting really close on the sponsorship graphics. That looks really sharp all the way through, particularly that mobile logo there. Number 5 doesn't look bad either, but I like that. Definitely like it. You see the Williams logo there on the front of the nose. Very, very cool. Those end fences there. This is one of the big differences visually between the 86 and 87 car. The 86 car just had flat end fences there on the wing. The 87 car had these big flick-ups on the rear section of the front wing end fence, and then it just controlled the air going around the tire squirt area in the front. But one of the big differences between the 86 and 87 cars, those front wing end fences. Move it to the midsection of the car here. Again, that nice finish on all these textures continues throughout. It's absolutely wonderful to look at. Oh, and have a look inside the wheel here. Have a look at that brake. That's great. That's absolutely great. It is not cross-drilled, but it's got this this fluting carved into the surface of the brake rotor, and just look at that. Look at that. I haven't seen that on a Formula 1 car before. I've seen that on very high-performance road cars, but never on a Formula 1 car. First time for everything, I guess. Great. Looking around at the cockpit, yeah, very businesslike in there. Must have been very, very tight. I don't know how these guys had room in there, but they did. They managed. Outlet section of the side pod. Radiator duct. Love that. That nice finish continues all the way through the duct. Very nice. Looking at the inside, or the front side of that duct, rather. You can see the side pod's been split in two, so air is channeled outboard and inboard. The inboard air, of course, goes in to the engine bay for some more cooling and probably some turbo intake, but yeah, very cool. Then, of course, the rear section, dominated by that tremendous gearbox casing, but you can see some dampers on either side of the gearbox. Very, very cool. And then the diffuser, what they had of diffusers back then, they were still playing with underbody aerodynamics. Again, this is only a few years removed from the ground effect days, so they're still kind of in that late 70s, early 80s philosophy of trying to seal the under tray as much as they can. They had not quite made the transition to topside bodywork in the pursuit of downforce. They were still only really dealing with front and rear wings for the most part. You can see these big intake snorkels on the sides of the side pods. Those are the intake plenums for the turbo, as far as I am aware. So double turbo, so you have one intake plenum per side. Those are not brake ducts. The brake ducts are on the rear suspension. I can't really get a good angle on them, but yeah, look toward the rear of the car and you'll see these things sticking up from the rear wheels. Those are your brake ducts for the rear brakes. The front brake ducts are more conventional, and you can see them right here on the sides of the front tires. There you go. Traditional suspension layout, you have double wishbone and push rods front and rear. Very, very cool, and what you would expect from this time. Morph into the cockpit and have a look. We fly through the side of the monocoque there. They haven't quite implemented that perfectly, but who cares? Who goes in showroom view except me? But anyway, see some nice detail going on in here. You can see right down into the pedal box. There are no pedals to see, but again, who cares? Big tachometer, mounted front and center. You can't really see it while you're out on track, but you can just sort of peek through the steering wheel. You can see when it's between 10 and 12, which is where you're going to be shifting anyway. It's never going up to 14 grand, so don't worry about that. Gear lever there detailed with the linkage going to the rear. Very nice. Looks like a brake bias adjuster on the left side of the dash. Again, things aren't terribly detailed in here, but I'm going to put that in the who cares category. Another lever up front and to the left toward the bottom side of the bulkhead. Not entirely sure what that was. Perhaps front anti-roll bar, something like that. Not quite sure. And looking around, seatbelt's kind of just floating out here in space, but see the backside of the cockpit, see the seat, Nigel Mansell, and the roll hoop. Very, very cool. The eye point in here is very low. If I were to try to drive the car from this angle, I would not be able to see much of anything, but we're going to be driving from a little bit higher up. See nice mirror detail there. They're exactly where you'd want them to be. Nice visibility while you're out on track. Fly out of the car through the opposite side. And now we fly back overhead to put us where we were when we started. There are no opening features on this car. Be cool to have a look at that engine in there, but no opening features. What we do have, however, is this. Watch the front and rear wings. Press the 0 key on the number pad and the slot gap on the rear wing opens up. Press the 2 key on the number pad and the angle of attack on the front wing flap changes. So you can see we're in low downforce trim, now high downforce trim, low downforce trim, high downforce trim. You get the idea. Only animated features on this car. Again, removable bodywork. It's one of those things you can get away with because, again, you don't see it at any other time except here. So I think we can forgive them for that. I have to say, though, and just look at this modeling once again. It's superbly done, and for the very modest price that they're asking for this, it's phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. This is on par with some of the best third-party mods I have seen for Assetto Corsa, and it's on par in terms of exterior details with stock Kunos cars. So, again, hats off to you guys, ACFL. Great job indeed. Of course, last but not least, we've got to get this thing out onto the track. We're going to go to Brands Hatch today, the quintessential mid-80s turbo Formula 1 circuit, and of course, we're going to be driving the Red 5 Nigel Mansell at his home track. We'll see you there in a moment. Welcome to Brands Hatch. Here's the FW11B sitting here in the pit lane getting ready to go. Of course, we're going to have a look at the setup screens before we get out on track just to show you what's what and the many, many things that you can play with here in the settings. Of course, we have our gearbox here, 1st through 6th, plus final drive. You can play with these in any way you like. Plenty of different configurations for different circuits and downforce configurations. Your tires, you have your pick of the crop. You've got qualifying, which of course is really soft and only good for maybe 2, possibly 3 really fast laps. You've got your softs, mediums, and then hard. So 4 tire compounds at your disposal. For this run, we're going to be using the mediums. And of course, you can play with your tire pressures. The default value is 17 PSI. It goes all the way down to 9 and then all the way up to 25. So you can play with that in any amount you prefer. Of course, no refueling in Formula 1 in this era, so big fuel tank goes all the way up to 195 liters. We'll shut the engine down for the moment. Electronics, this is where you're going to make your turbo adjustments. As with some other turbo cars, you can ramp the turbo all the way down to 0 in the pit lane. In the car, however, the lowest adjustment you have is 10%, so when you're out on track and you turn the boost down, the minimum is 10%, and of course it goes all the way up to 100, which you can, of course, access from the cockpit. Wings, this is the only aerodynamic adjustment that we have available to us on this car. Just like in showroom view, as we change the wing angle, you can see the angle of attack rise and fall. As you change your settings, of course, you also see this on the rear wing. So you can see the slot gap there, opening and closing. We'll leave it back at where it was, because I've already trimmed the car out to be pretty much where I want it. Our alignment settings, you have camber and tow on all 4 corners. Want a little bit more negative camber on the rear. Dampers, your bump stops, fast and slow, bound and rebound, all that kind of good stuff for you. Diff power, a little bit more diff coast perhaps, but yes, this is the same as in many other cars, Kunos and third party. Generic engine limiter. This is interesting. Goes down to 95 and all the way up to 108. This is effectively the rev limit on the engine, so as with the Lotus 98T, you have to be very careful when you're playing with this setting, particularly in conjunction with higher levels of boost, because the engine will start to rip itself to pieces before too long. We're going to leave it all the way up at 108%, because that's how we roll around here. Suspension, anti-roll bars front and rear. This car, in other runs I've done with it, has felt a little bit stiff on the front, so we're going to soften that down a little bit. The anti-roll bar on the rear at 0, that's the default value, and it actually feels okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Wheel rates and ride heights, of course, front and rear. Unlike in a lot of other modern cars, these cars don't tend to run a lot of rake front relative to rear. Rake meaning that the front end is lower in ride height than the rear. Because this car doesn't really have a diffuser, as it were, you can get away without much rake. There is a diffuser there, but it doesn't work in exactly the same ways as more modern ones do, so you can deal with a fairly neutral front to rear ride height difference, so it's okay. And then your advanced suspension settings, packers and travel ranges on all 4 corners, we'll leave them where they are. So, we'll put some fuel on board, and we will head out on the racetrack. Do 56, 55 liters. That should be more than sufficient. So here we are in the cockpit. You can tell the eye point is a little bit higher than it was in showroom view, which is good if you'd like to see where you're going. On the dash, I'd just like to point out the three figures that you can see. The 0% is obviously our turbo boost pressure commanded, 0% coming out of the pits. The 56 in the middle is perplexing because that number never changes. I don't know what it means, but I do know that it is constant throughout the entire duration of a run. And then the 55L is clearly our fuel level in liters, 55 liters in the tank. So without further ado, clutch in, first gear, raise the revs a bit, and off we go. I apologize in advance if the engine audio is not quite as loud as you would like. This car is very, very loud, and it's actually taken me quite a while to get the levels to an acceptable point with the voiceover and the in-game sound. So if I haven't gotten it exactly right, I apologize, but trust me, it was not through lack of trying. So just a little install lap here. Start to get everything up to temperature. Of course, we're at 0 boost pressure, so the turbo's just venting directly to atmosphere. And the engine, of course, feels very, very sluggish right now because it is not boosted. And 1.5 liter V6 can't be running more than maybe 250 horsepower in this trip. So just an install to get everything working. Go up and down through the box, make sure everything's good there. Tire temps going, get some brake temps going. We'll be getting on with the program in earnest. One thing I'd like to mention as we start to ramp the boost up to more respectable levels, the sounds that you're hearing. Those of you who are sim racing veterans and have been around this e-sport, I guess we could call it, for quite some time, you will be very familiar with the sounds that you're hearing, at least in the internal views. These are, from what I can tell, pretty much exactly the same sounds as we heard on the McLaren in the 1988 Formula One mod for R Factor from all those years ago. Of course, the engine in this car is virtually identical to the one that was in the 1988 McLaren MP46, so it would make sense that it would sound very similar. Exactly the same sounds, though. I guess I understand why they would do that. Why recycle something? Rather, why not recycle something that's good and already appropriate for your subject matter? I think it's a decent fit for this car, and they are quite familiar. It's kind of comforting in that aspect, because of course I've turned a lot of laps in that 1988 R Factor mod. All right, things are really starting to come up to temperature now. I've already got confidence. The car's feeling good. And off we go. Aside from the first impressions, sound-wise, first impressions you get in the car in terms of handling. I mentioned that the front end felt a little bit stiff in other runs that I have done in this car, and those of you who have seen the video of this car racing some other turbo cars here at Brands Hatch, you might have picked up on the fact that I had a bit of understeer throughout that run. The same is true here, and it's not for reasons that you might initially think. The front axle on this car just feels very stiff in general, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. I know the anti-roll bar settings were very high, especially relative to the rear, which is set at 0. But it doesn't feel like there's much suspension movement going on in terms of roll or heave, really. The onboard shots from that race, you can see some heave going on in the suspension, but it doesn't quite translate into feel in the cockpit. And there's essentially no suspension movement in moments of roll. It's something I've noticed in Formula One in much more recent years. We've started to see a lot more roll in the cars. I would say after 2011 or so, when Pirelli really started to get crazy with their tire compounds into a high degradation mode, the teams started to take some loading away from the tires directly and transmit those loads more so into the chassis. And this meant making the cars a bit softer all around, having them roll and heave a little bit more around the corners just to take some of that stress away from the tires so that it could make them last a little bit longer. We didn't see a whole lot of roll in Formula One before that. Certainly look at onboards all the way through the mid to late 90s and through the first part of the 2000s. The cars were absolutely rock stiff in pretty much all conditions. We barely saw any suspension movement whatsoever, at least from the front end. And that maxim appears to apply here as well. The car just feels very, very stiff. Part of that comes from the suspension, and I'm going to say most of that comes from the chassis, because of course these are the days when the carbon composites that are now ubiquitous in Formula One, they were still figuring them out in this era in the mid-80s. Of course, McLaren introduced it in 1981. Here we are in 1987, and the technology has moved on from that starting point, and it's kind of in its adolescence right now. So they're still figuring out the optimum way to lay up that carbon cloth for a stiff chassis, yet to maintain good overall chassis dynamics. So definitely a little bit of teething issues there in terms of technology. I will say, though, that stiffness on the front axle does make the car very predictable, if not slightly frustrating at times, because it does induce understeer, but the car feels stable, and it certainly gives me enough confidence to progress with this run while giving it some sufficient beans. The gearbox, it is absolutely rifle bolt. Everything is very smooth and direct. It'll shift just as quickly as you can, and it's not even necessary to engage the clutch on upshifts. I'm doing it for the sake of reliability throughout the run, but as we come out of here, lift the throttle, you're in gear. So it's not always necessary to engage the clutch on your upshifts. Your downshifts, however, if you want them to be smooth and you don't want to have any locking of the rear axle, yes, you'd better be using that clutch. Then, of course, we have the very important matter of the engine. This car is stereotypical turbo in every regard. There is a lot of power and there is a lot of lag. You really notice it when you ramp the boost up even higher. Right now we're running at 50%. The maximum race boost level is 70%, so just like on the 98T, you've got to make sure that you don't exceed 70% for too long. Otherwise, the engine will become unreliable. The top end will say, enough, I'm going to petition the UN for grievances in violation of my human rights, and yes. So 70% is your race boost limit on this engine, just like it is in the 98T. However, turbo lag, it is a thing. It's a really big thing in this car. Those of you who have been watching for a while, you'll know all about my throttle blipping technique. Just an instinctive thing that I do throughout the corners, particularly in turbo cars, and it doesn't quite work in this car. The lag is so severe that it really doesn't lend itself to any tricky throttle manipulation, because there's just really no boost to be had until that engine hits about 8,500, 9,000 RPM. Doesn't matter what you're doing with the throttle through the corners, until the revs hit that point, there is no boost. Remember Nelson Piquet, I remember reading something years ago when he was at Brabham, and he was describing the Brabham BT52, that car powered by the 4-cylinder BMW engine. He likened it to firing a rifle. You point it at a spot on the horizon, more or less where you'd like to end up. You squeeze the trigger, and then you just hold on tight and hope that your efforts pay off. This car, very much like that. Until the boost comes on, everything is, actually it almost feels kind of slow, and then the boost comes in and you hold on tight. way the boost comes on in its initial attack is actually a bit more intense than on the 98T. Although once the boost is established, the power delivery is much less intense than it is, at least at full boost, on the 98T. Of course, this car was limited in the 1987 spec to 4 bar of boost pressure. The 98T is generating about 5 bar of boost at full chat, so there's a little bit less overall power in this car all around. We're still talking over 1,000 horsepower, however, in qualifying trim. Speaking of qualifying trim, once we get through this twisty stuff, that's exactly where we're going to go. And 100%. And the engine is already crying enough. We are going to ignore its demands for the moment. Here's 1,000-ish horsepower down the front straight. Definitely know about every last one of those 1,000 horsepower. There is a lot of power in this car. Because the rear end is so soft relative to the front, there's really not much wheel spin to worry about, at least when your tires are fresh. They are able to cope with the torque demands pretty well, even over the bumps. So there's a lap at full boost for you. We'll ramp it back down to race boost, because I don't want the engine to blow up. Other overall impressions you get in the car. Practical things. Look at your mirrors. You get great visibility rearward. So when you're running in traffic, you got somebody close behind, you know exactly where they are at all times. No problem whatsoever. In that race video I did, you can see me cheekily pulling offline at some moments just to close the door on the guy behind. You can do that thanks to those mirrors. They are in the perfect position, and their size is actually pretty good in comparison to where your eyes are. So you can see plenty of things in the mirrors. Also, in terms of steering feel, and of course this is very subjective because it's going to depend largely on how your force feedback is set up and what wheel you're using. But on my Logitech G27, the steering is quite heavy. It's actually one of the heavier steering cars in all of Assetto Corsa, at least from where I'm sitting. It's comparable to, I would say, a BMW road car in terms of steering feel. If any of you have driven particularly a later model BMW road car, they go for a heavier steering setup in those cars. They don't particularly have so much feel, which this car certainly does, but in terms of steering weight, it's comparable to a BMW road car, at least through my setup right here, right now, on this day. Force feedback is very good. If you can see the force feedback load meter there in the pedal box, you can see that there is a little bit of clipping in high-speed corners, but all throughout the force range, everything is very communicative. I can definitely feel every bump on the road. I can feel everything that the chassis is doing. If I happen to lock a front wheel, I know all about that even before the vehicle status indicator comes on. Lots of information coming through the wheel to your hands. And all of that, of course, makes you faster. downshifts, as you can see, are also very quick. Rev matching is a must if you don't want to lock that rear axle, so some well-timed heel toe is sufficient to accomplish that. Some understeer there. The fast corner tires are not quite as new as they once were. They're still holding up very nicely. They've come in very well on this run. All in all, I've got to say, this is a very, very good car. In terms of overall comparisons, what is it like to drive compared to similar cars? It is someplace in the middle between the 98T and the McLaren MP44 by VRC. This is easier to drive than the 98T, even though it's got a similar mode of power delivery. The McLaren MP44, in terms of chassis dynamics, is, in my opinion, the most difficult of the three. However, some other aspects of that car, particularly the way in which it delivers its power, because that one, of course, limited to 2.5 bar of boost in comparison to this one's 4. This one is a bit more explosive in its power delivery and just makes you hold on that much tighter as you're exiting a corner. So a happy medium between the 98T and the MP44 for those of you who are so interested. Back into the pits. And there we are, the Williams FW11B by ACFL. It's payware. It's different in terms of its distribution than a lot of third-party mods for not only Assetto Corsa, but pretty much all racing sims, in that it is payware and not strictly freeware. However, for the very modest price that they're asking, before the first of the year it was €2.50 and now it is €5, but however you get it, however you got it, I should say, certainly well worth it. It's a very, very modest price point for those of you who are interested, and I certainly have to say that you will not regret your decision to purchase this car if you so desire, because it is so 80s. When you think of 1980s Formula One, you think of cars like this one, you think of Nigel Mansell, you think of the Red 5, you think of that tire blowing out in Detroit and wrecking Mansell's championship fight. You think of all of that, and it's all embodied in this car, the Williams FW11B. Of course, Williams, this was their last year for the Honda engine. In 1988, they ran a Judd V8 in anticipation of Formula One going to completely natural aspiration in 1989. So this is the last turbocharged Williams, at least until 2014. And, of course, their last collaboration with Honda. In 1988, they ran a Judd engine, and then 1989, they had the beginning of that long and illustrious partnership with Renault. So the last Williams Honda is the same engine, basically, that was in the McLaren MP44. So definitely, if you've driven the 4.4, you will certainly enjoy this car, and it'll already feel somewhat familiar to you. So definitely, I have to say, ACFL, you've done a great job with this car. I can't really point out too many faults with it. That front axle, again, it feels stiff, but it doesn't feel unrealistic. I don't have too many miles in high fidelity, and by high fidelity I mean modern as in the last year or two, renditions of mid to late 80s F1 cars, aside from the 98T for the most part. So that front axle stiffness maybe it's realistic, maybe it's not, but it certainly feels believable, and it's certainly predictable, and it's just something you compensate for during your run. But it's an absolutely wonderful car. Do check it out. You will not be sorry you did. Of course, after this, there are 2 hot laps here at Brands Hatch with this car without commentary at full boost on qualifying tires, so you can get a sense of what this thing does all by itself when I can just focus 100% on driving the car. So do stay tuned for that. In closing, though, I would just like to say thank you all so very much for your continued support, for your comments, your likes, your shares, and your subscriptions. 2016 was an absolutely great year for this channel. It has achieved some notoriety. It's certainly achieved a lot of viewership, far beyond anything that I ever thought it would get, and I can only see it improving from here. So thank you all so very much for your continued engagement and your continued support. Stay tuned for the hot laps, everyone. FerrariMan601 saying thank you all so very, very much, and we will see you soon.